Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening. This is Property Management 101. And for today's video, I'm going to be reviewing with you 6 factors that you should be considering when determining what your staff count should be. This video is going to apply best to anyone that works on the development side of the multifamily industry when it comes to putting a staff together, and that may be putting together that pro forma or the future budget for that asset or simply hiring staff for that asset. This video will apply very well to that side of the industry, but a lot of the factors that I'll be talking about today can be considered and have some crossover to other sides of the industry as well. The details I share with you today, that'll be a new construction asset that'll be currently being built, or if it's an aspect where the property is being rebranded. So everyone's moving out, maybe there's going to be major renovations going on, maybe it's changing the demographic it's going after, maybe it's going from a student property to a conventional property. So this could be another example where this will commonly happen when you have to determine what that staff count should be. The most common ratio that I typically hear about in the industry is the 1:100 ratio. And what that is referring to in the conventional side of the industry, typically for every 100 units that you have at your property, you're going to have one full-time office staff member and one full-time maintenance staff member. So for example, at a property with 300 units, you're going to have a total of 6 full-time staff members. 3 of them will work directly in the office and 3 of them will work on the maintenance side. Each company typically has the ratios that they look to achieve and build into that property and pro forma when they're working on things when it comes to the development side. But today's video, I'm going to be sharing with you 6 factors that should be considered when you're putting together how many staff you're going to need or not going to need when it comes to staffing and building your staff count at a property. The number one factor that should be considered when you're putting together your staff count and your team is your exterior areas. How much grass, mulch, parking lots, sidewalks, rentable items like storage units or garages should be things that should be considered when it comes to staffing your property. If you have more of these areas than your typical asset, then you may want to consider more staff, more grounds, maybe even budget for more vendors. You definitely want to take this in consideration because if you have an abnormal amount of exterior areas, you may need more staff. But that also applies if you have lower amounts of these areas, you may be able to get away with less staff. So depending on the asset and depending on the amount of exterior areas, this should be considered as part of how many staff you need at that particular asset. The second factor that should be considered when it comes to staff counts is your amenity areas. So this includes all exterior and interior amenity areas. Any area that can be used by your residents, whether it be 24/7 or at scheduled times, should be some areas that you should be considering as far as building up your staff count. Again, if you have a lot of amenity areas, then that may be something you want to consider maybe having more staff, not less, to take care of and maintain those areas. So areas like exercise rooms, car wash stations, fire pits, grills, pool areas, computer labs, reading lounges, theater rooms are all things that you want to consider when you're putting together your staff count. Any area that residents have access to should be considered as part of these amenity areas. The third factor that you want to consider when you're putting together your staff count is your average rents. So at most properties, the higher the rent, the higher the expectations that clientele and demographic or residents typically have. If you have rents that are high against the average rents in that market, and what you typically have as a company, you may not want to use the typical staff ratios because your expectation of what you need to achieve for rents is also going to be met with higher expectations from your clientele. So it's going to be really important that you take that in consideration as well and not just considering 1 or 2 metrics when it comes to this. Sites that are looking to achieve and have higher rents also offer more. They typically may have more exterior space, they may have more amenity areas, they may have more areas that you want to take in consideration anyway. So this kind of builds into the first 2 factors that I mentioned, is that typically when you have higher rents, you also typically have more of the 2 factors that I mentioned. If you're enjoying this video and you're learning something new, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for future videos. The fourth factor that you want to consider when you're putting together your team is you want to consider current and future strategy at that asset. If your asset is a stabilized asset and doesn't have any changes in the near future when it comes to your strategy there, you shouldn't be staffing that the same way that you may want to staff a renovation or a lease up or a rebranding of the property. So this is going to be really important to consider as well, is that this one is commonly forgotten because if you think about it, not all strategies are going to be equal amount of work. If you have a situation where you're requiring residents to move out, for example, on a renovation, you're going to have a dynamic where you're going to have a lot more residents moving in that is needed to achieve its ideal occupancy than a stabilized property. This is why taking into consideration the strategy of the current position and the future position is so needed when determining your staff count. The fifth factor that you want to consider when you're putting together your team is number of units. This is the most common factor that I see used when a company is putting together a pro forma that is outlining how many staff members are needed at that particular asset. This can be a good guideline to use, but also you need to consider the other factors that I've already mentioned in this video. I've often seen where a staff may be underperforming because the staff count there is not able and equipped to handle maybe all the amenity areas, maybe all the grounds, and maybe the strategy that property is needing. So it's really important that you factor in other things than just simply unit count when putting together the staff that is needed at that particular property. Not all unit counts are created equal. And the last factor that I would recommend considering when you're putting together your teams and your staff counts of particular properties is the square footage of the units. When you look at an asset and you determine what the average square footage is at that particular property per unit, this is going to be a really helpful guideline as well. Properties that have higher average square footage than other properties, even if they have the same unit count, the same strategy, the same amenity areas, and the same exterior areas, are still going to demand more work. So it's going to be important to consider this as well. Another way to look at this is by comparing two examples. For example, when property A has 300 units, and it has 100 of each floor plan, 101 bedrooms, 102 bedrooms, and 103 bedrooms. But let's say property B has the same unit count of 300 units, but has 175 one bedroom, has 152 bedrooms, and has 25 three bedrooms. Example A in this scenario is more likely going to have more work that's needed, as these floor plans are going to typically have less square footage in example B. So it's going to be really important to factor in this overall square footage of your property as well. The other thing to consider for this comparison, if you have more square footage at your property, even though you may have the same unit count and the same strategy and the same exterior and amenity areas, that you're still going to have more vendor cost, more turn cost, more maintenance supply cost, your turn times are going to take longer, and also your vacancy loss is going to be higher. So these are some things you want to factor into your budget when putting it together, is evaluating the square footage per unit as well. And for a video recap today, please keep in mind these 6 factors when you're putting together what staff count is needed for your asset. Number 1, your exterior areas. You want to put together all of your exterior areas and get some measurements when it comes to this. And you want to include things like parking lots, sidewalks, parking garages, grass areas, mulch areas, anything that your maintenance team will have to maintain when it comes to your property. The second thing you want to consider as a factor when putting together your staff count is your amenity areas. So take in consideration all interior and exterior amenities that residents have access to. The more amenity areas you have, the more staff members you may need. The third factor you want to consider is your average rents. Typically, if your rents are higher, you're going to need more staff to meet those expectations those higher rents demand. Fourth, you really want to look at the current and future strategy of the asset. If we're going to be changing the strategy in the near future or currently, we were going to want to staff it different than a stabilized asset with no change in sight. Number 5, you really want to look at the number of units you have at your property. You cannot staff a 100 unit property the same way you staff a 500 unit property. So this will be important to consider when you're putting together your staff counts and your ratios per that asset. And last, number 6, you want to determine what your average square footage for your units at that particular property. If it's above your average, you may want to consider adding some more staff than you typically do. If it's below your average, you may be in a position where you may be able to get away with maybe a part-time worker instead of a full-time worker because it doesn't demand as much attention for turns and other things. So these are some things to keep in mind when it comes to your square footage. If you enjoyed this video and you learned something new, please don't forget to like, subscribe, and turn on notifications for future videos. Before putting any of these practices into place, please watch our updated disclosure video as well as our updated why we do this video, which is the channel's why. And I'll be providing a link to both of those in the video description. And to stay on top of industry news, polls, and video releases, please feel free to connect with our LinkedIn and our Instagram page. If you have any questions about this video or any of our videos, feel free to leave a comment. I'll be happy to address it for you. Happy leasing!